Good morning to you, Riva. First question to you is, what major interventions, looking at the amount of money that the U.S. has poured into Africa with regards to healthcare and so on, what major intervention areas would you say the U.S. is really interested in?
Hey, thank you for inviting me and joining this afternoon. Actually, I would raise the Secretary Pompeo's number because it's actually $90 billion that the U.S. has contributed to healthcare in Africa since 2003, when George W. Bush inaugurated the PEPFAR program. So $60 billion of that directly, $30 billion of that to the Global Fund. And what's that been for is for the fight against HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. And so that has provided, from my experience, the backbone by which this COVID-19 virus is being responded to. And so I think U.S. assistance will continue to be in that area. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it certainly does. Now, with regards to Nigeria, I believe we've also been a recipient of part of this 90 billion, of course, of the 60 billion portion as well. But there have been some pretty challenging times that the country has faced, as have been in the news. What areas do you think the United States can assist in with regards to Nigeria's fight against COVID-19?
It's a great question. As you know, you were talking about it. We're pretty preoccupied in the United States with our own challenges. But nonetheless, the U.S. is now beginning to focus on Africa. Donald Trump, as you saw, spoke to 4 different African heads of state, including your head of state, including Nigeria's President Buhari, and talked about now that supply chains are open up, the ability to look at providing ventilators, oxygen, PPEs. And then as we go to Congress in May, when Congress comes back, I believe there's going to be a significant effort to plus up our Global Health Fund and our foreign assistance to provide support to Africa, because there's an increasing belief, I believe, that what happens in Africa, the effect of Africa to be able to manage the disease and the economic consequences will directly impact the United States.
Okay. I want to take your attention now to debt relief. What do you think Mike Pompeo meant when he said that they was going to look at the what and the how or the when with regards to debt relief for Africa?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, we have been following closely the bank fund meetings, the virtual meetings in spring, where the G7 plus G20 plus China said that there would be a halt of debt payments this year. But the real question is, what about forgiveness? What about a 2-year period? Because that's what it's going to take to recover. I believe Secretary Pompeo was signaling in these interviews that he will support a consensus of the G7 nations. And so that's what I would expect. I think that's also now increasingly his position on WHO. We know that our president announced a suspension of WHO funding, but now there appears to be a desire to work with G7 on WHO reform. And we think that's, again, an encouraging sign of U.S. engagement.
Excellent stuff. Now, you just mentioned President Trump wanting to announcing a halt of funding for the WHO. You wrote an article in The Hill agreeing with the head of the African Union, who was calling for the depoliticization of the fight against COVID-19. Can you add some color to that and what you're referring to?
Yes, please. Yes, please, I can. The head of the African Union has asked for a depoliticization of the WHO to fight this pandemic. And I think that's something in my column that I strongly supported, because you can't fight this pandemic with WHO hobbled. As you said, as your colleague said earlier, it's a critical institution. That being said, there is need for a self-assessment. There is a possibility of an interim correction to understand what can be done better. We're all capable of doing both our response and also taking a look at how we adjust our response. And I think that's increasingly where the U.S. position is coming. I would hope that if that type of discussion takes place, that there will be a reconsideration of ongoing U.S. support to the WHO. But I think we confuse the real issues about capacity to engage, understand, and be able to deal with some of these challenging countries like China when we politicize the conversation. I think that hurts us all.
All right, thank you for that. And also in the same column, you wrote that the fall in GDP of many African nations due to the COVID-19 impact is going to push a lot of people into poverty, is going to affect a lot of institutions. Where do you think African leaders should focus on in order to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on their respective economies?
It's a great question. I mean, I think what's coming out now is food security and liquidity. And people are understanding with up to 80% of the markets informal, there has to be a response both in terms of supply chains and food and liquidity. So I think that's what the African nations are focusing on. I would just raise one more issue because I want to make the point about the importance of Africa and U.S. national security. This new drug that you all were talking about earlier, remdesivir, which is now looking at a potential significant impact on stopping the replication of the virus in COVID-19. That drug was developed through trials of Ebola during 2014, 2016. It was supported with our public health dollars, and it was done in concert with African nations. So if we have a real therapeutic, it's going to be a therapeutic that was part of our collective global public health effort. I thought it would be good to make that case today.
All right. Well, thank you for making that case. And thank you for joining us on the Global Business Report on Arise News. Riva Levinson, the CEO of KRL International. We appreciate your time.